Hey there. My name is Dr. David Campt, and I'm with the Dialogue Company and the Voice Project. And I'm so grateful that you can join us for our 30-minute session about how to get people more involved in voting by focusing on mobilizing non-voters with storytelling. So I want to have my partner in the highest of crimes, I guess, herself. So go ahead and do that.
Hi, everybody. My name is Karin Tamerius. I am the founder of Smart Politics, and my background is in psychiatry and political psychology, and really excited to be here today.
So I'm David Campt, and I'm with the Dialogue Company, and I have spent a lot of years thinking about how people talk to each other more effectively so they can create more collaboration and a better world. So we're going to be on together for about a half hour. And let me just say what our agenda is for our time together. Yes, our topic is mobilizing non-voters through storytelling. And our agenda for today is going to cover these topics in a rapid but thorough succession. So we're going to have a little bit of discussion about understanding non-voters. We're going to talk a little bit about why stories change minds. I'm going to talk about the two types of stories and the method that we teach called the REACH method, 2 types of REACH stories. We're going to talk about how to craft a confessed story. That's what the C is in REACH. And then we're going to do a role play and then take any questions. So that is our plan. So just to give the bigger picture, this is our second of 7 of these. Last week we were on for an hour. This week a half hour. The rest of them will be half hour just like today. And the first 3 are focusing on mobilizing non-voters. We're still at the period where in most states you can still register. So this is such an important election. We need to be out there doing what we call relational canvassing or personal network canvassing, where we try to talk to people in our circle about getting involved in the election. So our first 3 sessions, last week, this week, and next week, are focused on mobilizing non-voters. And then the 4 sessions in October shift gears and talk about being persuasive, or at the minimum, relating to people across the ideological divide, which is so deep in our country. So, and it turns out that the REACH method is useful for both of those things. So today we're going to focus on the storytelling aspect. So before we get to this about crafting stories, we need to understand non-voters, and I'm going to say a little bit about that. So as we try to compassionately engage somebody who's a non-voter, it's important to prepare ourselves to understand where they're coming from. So if you're a voter, you might think, I don't understand those people. What's wrong with them? And it's important to have a stance of empathy and compassion towards them. So what are some reasons, what are some factors around the non-voting phenomenon? One thing that we have to face is the fact that we're in a country where about 45% of people don't vote. Like it's really close between people who vote and people who don't vote. We're just barely over 50%. In the 2016 election, 100 million people didn't vote. So one of the things for you to think about is that no matter who you're for, there's tens of millions of people on your side who tend to lean, whichever way you lean, who didn't vote. And so part of the reason why we're doing this is to improve democracy, but also we're trying to empower people so they can impact the elections more by getting people on their side to vote. A lot of people are of similar orientation, people in their circle, but a lot of people are not voting, and we don't like to talk about politics at all because we're so tense. So we're trying to give people tools of dialogue so they can get past that. Okay, why don't people vote? Well, some of the common reasons, I mean, everybody's different, but there's some common reasons for that. One of them is the issue of apathy. And that can look in a lot of different ways. That can look like people are not worried about the future, or they're unaware of other people's experiences because we're going to be so isolated in our silos, or people think that I don't have enough information. I'm a low information. That's too complex. I don't have that. Or people don't have compassion for other people, or they just lack commitment. So there's a bunch of things that all are in the apathy rubric that we could call it. But there are other issues that matter too. Some of it is a self-image question where people are saying, I don't know enough to vote, or I'm just not a political person, or I can't make a difference. These are the kind of things you might hear. Or people who might say my views don't matter, or even it's not my responsibility, it's somebody else's responsibility. So so the self-image issue is part of what can be an impediment to people voting. Cynicism. Oh, it doesn't matter. Hey, why should I vote? The system is rigged anyway. or there's no good options. But what do you mean? The choices are all the same. It's all the same cabal of people. So that's another set of reasons why people don't vote. Next is sometimes people have practical barriers where they say they would tell you there's not enough time, or they don't have enough energy, or it takes resources to do all that. They got to take off of work, and it gets away from their income, or there's just too little information, or they think they lack the needed skills to vote. So that's another category or bucket of reasons. And then there's also systemic barriers that can exist and that can exist in people's minds. So there's too many registration requirements. It's too complicated. Or the ID, I don't have the ID and I've this voter ID in my state. Or they're worried about the language barrier. Or there's not that many polling locations and there's cutbacks in many places. Or it's not a national holiday. So, and of course, some of these are not perception issues, but just like the reality of what we face. There's not a universal mail-in ballot. It's same-day registration is not a common thing. And of course, there's efforts to try to purge people from the rolls, and people who, in many states, people who have committed felony cannot vote. So those are some reasons why. Some of those are objective reasons. Some of those are perceptual reasons. But it's important as we try to engage people who don't vote that we have go in with some understanding of why that might be. So Karin is a psychiatrist, and she, as a person who studies the mind, she can tell us more about why it's valuable to use stories to try to move people forward, which is the method that we teach.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. So one of the important things about the reach method, one of the big reasons it works, is because it uses stories rather than just telling people what they should do and prescribing action. We instead try to change people's minds. And we do that by providing a new narrative. Now, why? Why are stories so powerful? Well, I love this quote from Jonathan Haidt. He said, "The human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor." And it really goes to the heart of the problem that a lot of us have when we go into a situation and we're trying to influence a voter. A lot of times we think, oh, if I can just make a compelling argument for why this person should vote, then they will understand and they will invest the resources necessary in order to cast that ballot. But the reality is that logic and reason don't have that kind of effect, and stories do. So first of all, why is that? And to understand why, you have to go back millennia to the period during which human beings were evolving. And it's important to realize that human beings evolved in very small, tight-knit communities, really communities that were no larger than about 150 people in size. So everybody in your life you knew, and relationships were far more important than facts and data. Relationships mattered more than reason or logic. The other thing that's important to realize is that information just wasn't available in large quantities. Data is a relatively new thing, and our brains have not adapted to it. We can be impacted by individual events, things that happen to individual people or small groups of people, but we can't process things that happen to large numbers of people. It doesn't hit us at an emotional level. And finally, it's important to realize that actually changing your mind about things under those conditions was kind of dangerous. If you have a belief system that's been working for you for a long time, changing it on a whim doesn't make a lot of sense, because you might make a small change that has a big impact on your ability to survive. So the brain is actually wired to be very careful about making changes in opinions, attitudes, and behavior. And so people are resistant. Stories, on the other hand, unlike logic and reason and data are very powerful. And they're powerful for a number of different reasons. First of all, they allow us to avoid defensiveness. When we're telling a story about ourselves or about someone else. We are not focusing on the person in front of us who we are trying to change. And therefore, they don't feel personally attacked by it. The second thing stories do is that they foster empathy. Their research shows that the brains of storytellers and the brains of listeners actually become synchronized during the telling of stories. And the emotions that show up in the mind of a storyteller also show up in the mind of the person listening. And so if you want someone to have compassion and empathy, the best way to do it is to reach them through a story. The other thing that's really important about stories is that because of their emotional impact, they are more memorable. Research shows that if you provide the same facts just as in list form or in prose form, it doesn't have the same impact as facts that are presented within the context of a narrative. So if you want people to remember things, the best way to do it is with a story. The other thing that stories do that's really important is they can help people create a new way of thinking about the world. One of the most powerful forces organizing each individual's worldview is their story of how the world works. And if you want people to move to a place where their worldview is shifted, the best way to do that is to introduce a new narrative with a story of your own. And finally, stories are very powerful because you can use them to convey morals or messages. And we're going to talk about how to do that a little bit later. So David, do you want to go ahead and tell what the two big kinds of reach stories are?
Sure, I'll do that, but I'm going to first give a brief rundown of the REACH method. And so REACH is a conversational management strategy, and it stands for, each of the letters stands for a particular strategy. So one is reflect, and reflect means you got to calm down. You got to, it's important to take a moment to intentionally try to calm yourself down, because part of what impedes our capacity to influence other people is that we're agitated and we're not making calm-centered choices. Second, you want to inquire, British spelling, which means ask a question or even multiple questions to try to understand where the person is coming from. So you're trying to delay. You're not just you're delaying you articulating your point of view, but you're learning more about the other person's point of view, where they're coming from. That's going to be very important. Agree. You want to try to verbally express some level of agreement with them, because part of what that does is it reduces their kind of response to you as a foreign invader trying to change where they are. Like, as going back to what Karin was talking about, we want to appear psychologically to be in their tribe, not into an opposing tribe. And sometimes when we're trying to change their views, people look at that, they experience that like we're trying to physically harm them at a psychological level. So we want to agree, and so to mitigate some of that response. Then you get to the storytelling element. So in agree, you tell them you agree with them, you empathize, you demonstrate empathy. But in confess, you show them that by telling them a story that shows that you have some level of alignment with how they are thinking. And that's the confession part. So you confess that, I am where you are sometimes, or have been where you are in the past. So you try to further the alignment and the sense of resonance by telling a story about that. And then harmonize, here's where you tell another story that lifts up your point of view and actually tries to invite them into your point of view. And you also try to, in the sense of, in this context of non-voters, you try to link back their what they want, which you found out in the inquire step, to the decision to vote, which is what you want, and what you've demonstrated by your harmonized story. You've expressed your truth that voting is a good thing, and you can move away from what you confessed, which is, I understand why you might not want to vote. Okay, so that's the overall picture. So confess story. again, you're talking to a non-voter who you have conceivably has told you about why they don't want to vote. They've hopefully in the inquire step, you have gotten them to tell you a story about that. You've not just asked them why you don't want to vote. You actually want to go past asking them the why and asking them to tell you a story about their not wanting to vote. Because as Karin has advised me in the past, I'm so grateful for her insights. Sometimes people telling you the reasons for something, you don't get to the real reasons as much as you get to a deeper truth if you ask them to tell you a story about some conclusion they've come to instead of just the conclusion. So, but in your confess story, you're trying to tell them about a time you felt the same, right? And that tends to build more empathy and fires up those circuits that Karin was talking about. It validates their experience. It shows you understand their point of view. So it tends to build trust, right? Because you're telling them, I know where you are. I know where I have been there or I'm there sometime. And telling stories models a kind of a self-reflection that you want them to have to really look at themselves more critically and more reflectively. Now, the harmonized story is a story about how you've changed. If you've told a story about how you have been where they are at some point, and it may or may not be about voting exactly, you also want to tell them a story about how you have moved on from that, from a similar state of a disempowerment. So you want to tell that story so you inspire them and you show them that change is possible and you do that modeling for them. But here's where you're inviting them to a new way of thinking about the problem. You try to inspire their action. Part of what people do is they just go to inspire action and tell them a new way of thinking instead of showing them that they have done that. And that's part of that. That's why this method builds upon what we know about people's psychology and lower their resistance and make it more likely that you're going to be able to influence somebody. Okay, so you got to have some sense of how to craft your story. And so Karin's going to talk a little bit about how one might do that.
Thanks, David. Yeah, and for this section, I'm really relying heavily on the work of Marshall Gantz. For those who are familiar with him, he was one of the primary advisors to Barack Obama during his first presidential run, and helped him craft his personal story in a way that connected with voters. So this is the Marshall Gantz model of narrative structure. It has, I believe, 5 components. The first component, obviously, is a character. Somebody is having something happen, and they are taking actions that produce some kind of outcome. The most important part of the narrative structure for our purposes is that a person is facing some kind of challenge, and in response to that challenge, they make a choice. And the outcome of that choice demonstrates the message you want the other person to internalize. The beauty of a well-told story is that the message or moral will come through so clearly that you don't actually need to articulate it yourself. The person will hear the story and immediately recognize the message without you having to take that extra cognitive step of putting the message into explicit words. So how do we construct a confess story using this model? And in my experience, constructing a story is challenging for a lot of people. So this is a really good thing for you to do actually during the reflect step of the REACH method. Take some time to think through the kind of story you will tell to people when they come to you. I know David and I both like to think in terms of having a few powerful stories in your pocket that you carry around and can pull out at any time as needed. So let's start with a simple case of where the character in the story is you. The moral or message that you want to convey with your story is, as David said, for a confess story, I understand where you're coming from because I've been there too. And the challenge in this situation is the problem or attitude that's getting in the way of voting. The choice is a decision that you made when confronted with this challenge, and the outcome is what happened as a result of your decision. So let's go to a concrete example of a confess story. Again, the character is you. The moral or message you want them to come away with is, I understand where you're coming from because I've been there too. The challenge in this particular case is you've been talking with someone, and what they've told you is that they just feel like they don't know enough to vote. So you want to empathize with that challenge and connect around that challenge. So what you do is share a story about a time when you didn't think you knew enough to vote either. And then you demonstrate that you made a choice, and that choice was you didn't vote because you felt you didn't know enough. So a great example of this would be deciding not to vote in a local election because you didn't know who the candidates were and you didn't know what the issues were. And perhaps the outcome was that afterwards you felt really bad because you knew how hard your friends had worked on the campaign and you hadn't done the work necessary to inform yourself. Alternatively, you could use an outcome such as, I didn't know enough, I didn't vote. And as it turned out, the person who won was a really bad candidate, and they did some things that I felt harmed my town. And I regret that in retrospect. Now, one thing to keep in mind about confess stories is you can convey a message without being explicitly about the same thing the other person was talking about. If the theme of the story is still connected, even if the situation isn't identical, that can still be very effective. So let's suppose that you're talking with someone who's apathetic about voting. And basically what they're saying is, you know what, I don't really care how the election turns out because no matter what happens, it's not going to affect me. And what you can do is tell a story about a time when, for example, a friend of yours had a family member who became ill. And you decided that you were just too busy, you weren't going to help out. You could have helped out, but you just decided, oh, other people will take care of it, and didn't pitch in. Well, what's the outcome there? The outcome is, well, later, your son got sick, my son got sick, and no one was there to help me. That's a confession story. I didn't help other people. Now they're not around to help me. I'm paying the price. And that is not specific to voting, but it still sends the message that being a member of a community both has costs and benefits. And part of taking advantage of those benefits is paying the costs, pitching in, and doing what the society as a whole needs, even when it seems like it doesn't have implications for you. So, David, are you ready for the big role play?
For the big role play. Sure, I'm ready for the big role play. All right. So in this situation, I'm going to be an active voter who's a friend of Karen's, and she is shaky about voting. In fact, I've learned that in a happy hour that we had previously. So the premise is, I know that she said that in a big group, and now I'm talking to her privately. Okay, go. Hey, Karin, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, David. It's good to see you.
Nice to see you again. You know, at that happy hour we were at last week, you made a comment about how you weren't planning on voting, and I found that just really kind of intriguing. And I just want to ask, can we talk about that for a few minutes? I'm just curious about learning more about that. Sure. Yeah. So I was wondering, what do you think? How do you feel about the direction of the country? Like sort of the right track, wrong track thing that people ask. And within that context, what are the issues that you care about?
Yeah, well, the direction, I don't think things are going very well right now. But,
Uh-huh.
I don't know anybody who thinks things are going well right now. I mean, we've got a we've got a pandemic. We've got people who are out of work. You know, I it's things are bad. There's a Supreme Court justice just died. Like things,
Right.
yeah.
What is
Nothing
you care most about these days? So those are the ones you care about, the pandemic, so if you were to just lift up what the things you care about the most.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm worried about the pandemic, and I'm worried about my job
Mm-hmm.
because it I depend on other people having money to pay me, and if they lose their jobs and can't pay me, then yeah,
Got
it's
okay.
a scary time, I think, for everybody.
Oh, I hear you on that. I hear you. Okay, so let me ask another question. So I'm so curious. So, you said you weren't planning on voting. Tell me a story that from your past that makes you go, that impacts your decisions now about not wanting to vote.
Well, I will. Okay, David, I can tell you about the last time I tried to vote, and maybe that will give you some idea.
Sure.
So I went to the polling place. I stood in line for, I don't know, 2 hours waiting for a chance to cast a ballot.
2 hours. Wow.
It took a long time. Yeah. I mean, I was committed.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got to up to the front of the line, and they asked to see my ID so I could, verify who I was and get my ballot. And it was out of date. And then they told me I wasn't on the rolls anyway.
Oh man.
So,
Wow.
I'm not doing that again. I've got things to do with my time. And
right. No, your time's valuable. No, I get that. I'd have found that very, very disturbing. So I hear what you're talking about. It's funny. It reminds me that your story reminds me of a situation in which was happened several years ago. My mom, my mom was already declining. She had a lot of health problems, and she was in the hospital. And I didn't think she was getting that good of a treatment. And at the same time, I had an uncle who was in the same hospital, and like I didn't think they paid attention to him. And I thought this was like, is there a racial issue going on here? At the time I was a graduate student, and I was studying like disparities in health. And I was like, okay, if I want to make a complaint, if I want to talk to the head of the hospital about this, what do I have to do? And so, you know what I had to do? I would have to have submitted a form to the ombudsperson. And the ombudsperson would have to get back to me. And then for them to, then at that conversation, then I had to escalate it to like the diversity person. And then if I was satisfied, then I had to go to the head of the hospital. So I was like, ugh, that's just way too much to deal with. Like, even though I think this is a racial issue, that's just,
you have time, right? You have time.
Exactly. So I know I have been at that place of this. It's too logistically difficult, and I'm not going to go through that. So I hear what you're saying. But it's funny how so that's true, and let me tell you what happened a couple years later. So a couple years after that, then my mom became she like had a really catastrophic accident at the hospital, or a catastrophic result of a surgery, and I thought she was getting mistreated again. And so, and I had been my wife at the time was like, who was living out of town. She's like, you need to escalate this. You need to go through whatever you need to go through, because you might be able to get a different result. And they actually withheld treatment for my mom. Like they told us, oh, she's gonna die anyway. You don't need to. She's paralyzed. It's not gonna. You should just let her go. And I was like, oh no, this is the same. I saw this as the same thing that happened last time. So I decided that I could make a difference, and so I went through all of that process. I submitted the form. I saw the ombudsman. I saw the diversity person. I went through all of that. And what they did was they transferred her out of that unit away from that doctor. And they gave that doctor a reprimand, right? So here's a case where I went from not thinking that it's going to, like, my things could matter because it was too logistically difficult. So I just waded through it, and achieve a different outcome. So those things are possible. So I guess I would just encourage you to think about that, and also the fact that, like, my perception is that the people we elect actually have some impact on, like, how we're managing the virus. Like, you get these politicians are so all over the map, but there's some of them who, if they get enough pressure from people who said, I put you in office to do something about this, to make sure we find the right balance between the economy and protection, that, I mean, I think that what you want is more likely to be achieved if you actually, join other people and get involved in influencing these people, because they're responsive. Without our voices, they're just going to do what they want to do, which in many cases is nothing. So I encourage you to think about that. So let me just ask, are you, if I were to help you navigate those difficulties in voting, well, I mean, would you willing to accept my help in that? Because I know it can be a headache, but
like, you would make sure that next time I wouldn't have to stand in line for 2 hours and, like, find out that they.
I'll put it this way: I'll make sure that I'll work with you to make sure that you got your IDs in order and you follow the paperwork. Now, I can't control the line, but we could talk about we can strategize about places to go that have and times where you might have less of a line, because I think that you can get information about that. So I'd help you with that.
Yeah. Okay. I will accept your help, David. That's great.
All right. I'll check back with you. We'll talk about this next week.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So we're actually overtime.
Uh-oh.
So we're overtime. So I guess we don't have any questions, I am told, but I hope that folks see the method. Like, you notice what I did. I asked what in the inquire step, I asked her, I asked what she cared about, and I came back to that later. And then I asked for a story about why she didn't want to vote. And then when she told me for that story, I agreed. I expressed empathy and agreed. And then I told my own story that wasn't about voting, but that was about, like, the logistics are too difficult and I became disempowered. And then I told her that was my confess story. And then I told her in my harmonized step, I told her about how I got past that. And then I linked back to what she wants and why voting might be a thing to do. And then I made the ask, because one of the things that's important to do is to make the ask. 60% of non-voters have never been asked to vote. And sometimes you can get people to vote just by asking to vote as a favor to you. So we should probably close. Let me just say, thank you so much, Karin. And next week, we're going to focus on mobilizing non-voters, encouragement through empowerment. So basically, we're going to talk about mostly the step in the harmonized story. So we're going to go through the method. We'll have a different example. We'll do another role play, but we're going to hone in on how you use your empowerment story to get other people to feel empowered. So thank you so much. So if you enjoyed this, please join our watch party tonight at 8 p.m. And in fact, I will be able to be online to take any questions that come live. So if you like this, tell people about it and come back, and you can hear from us. I don't know if Karin can join, but I know I can, and we can respond to what comes up for y'all. So people need to feel that your offering solves a problem they have. Well, yes, that's true. So part of the task is to get used to explaining the connection between what you want them to do and the problem they have. That is part of the task. And the more you try it, the more you'll be able to do it. So I want to thank y'all so much for sticking with us. And we will see you tonight online and next Monday live and in person. Say goodbye, Karin.
Goodbye, Karin. See you later, David.
Thank y'all so much. Bye.